To understand the file more, we're joined from Beijing by Mr. Benny Kwok, the international relations expert, and from Sevilla by Mr. Meher Nicholas Fursley, the director of the EU ASEAN Centre and chair of the World Pensions Forum. Gentlemen, welcome to Think Tank. Mr. Kwok, how does Beijing view Macron's demand for a Ukraine ceasefire? What tangible leverage, if any, is China willing to apply on Russia to prevent a wider European collapse?
Hello, thank you for having me. Sorry for my throat. I would think that I don't think that Europe could have any effective pressure against its stance on supporting Russia on the Ukrainian crisis because whether the Ukrainian crisis could be stopped is based on the, I would say, the manner and or stance of the Ukraine, Russia, and the United States. Europe is not playing an important role on this Ukrainian crisis, even though those crises is just next to the Europe. So I would think that I would think China just simply ignores what the Europe's demand on helping or persuade to Russia to stop for so-called invading Ukrainian territories, unless the European Union could use the so-called subsidies to try to threaten the Beijing that if Beijing does not help the European Union to persuade Russia to stop the war, then the EU would put a very severe pressure and measures, especially for the for example, like the tariffs, very high tariffs on the Chinese-made goods, or especially, of course, the EVs, or otherwise. I don't think Beijing would, or otherwise, I don't think Beijing would listen what the Macron says, and the possibility for the European Union to use the tariff to threaten Beijing to stop the war, I don't think the chance is very high because Europe needs a China and China needs Europe as well.
Yes. Mr. Fursley, given the 47 billion euro trade deficit and disputes over sectors like electric vehicles, what practical steps can the European Union take to enforce fair reciprocity without triggering a damaged trade war with China?
It's a very difficult question, and I would say the balance of power is in the hands of China. So, when you're pressuring China, and that's a game, actually, that's a game Trump himself has played nonstop for 6 months. Remember, he started his, what he called, trade liberation war in early April of this year, and it was much more than trade, right? It was an essential realignment of the world economy, right? And so it started, in early April, and on the 30th of October, precisely 5 weeks ago, Trump met with Chairman Xi Jinping in Seoul, South Korea. And what they did in South Korea 5 weeks ago, during that 5 hours nonstop meeting, is really, they carved out, they divided the world economy, in essence, and they left Europe out. And why was Europe out? Very simply, because remember, 30th of October, that is the Chinese-American summit in Seoul. What happened before that? On the 30th of July, Ursula von der Leyen, who is much more powerful and more influential than poor Emmanuel Macron, right? Ursula von der Leyen, she went to Scotland in a private golf club named after Trump's grandmother. You couldn't make it up. And she basically submitted to Trump in the name of Europe, because she agreed to a 15% tariff on all European exports to America, but much worse and much more dramatic for the future of the European economy. What did Ursula von der Leyen agree to? She's speaking in the name, by the way, of German, Italian, and French private sector industrial companies, which is illegal, but no one cares in Europe. She told the Americans that she would vouch for the fact that all big French, German, Italian, industrial corporations in the next 3 years would invest trillions of dollars every year in new factories in Oklahoma, New York, Tennessee, Baltimore. What does it mean? That all that money, industrial investment, long-term capital investment by the likes of Siemens or Renault or Total or the biggest, industrial companies in France and Germany, all that money will go now to new and expanded factories in America and less money invested at home in Europe. It's a disaster. So of course, when he met Xi Jinping in Seoul, he knew that Europe was already defeated. And now Macron, in a very ridiculous way, is flying to China, desperately trying, to salvage that economic relation with China. But the Chinese don't need him. I mean, there was a window when the Chinese needed Europe. And that was between April and the end of October, when Trump was pressuring the Chinese very aggressively. Then the Europeans, they had leverage. They could have gone, Ursula von der Leyen and Macron, to Beijing before the 29th of October, and the Chinese would have given them a sweet deal. Now the Chinese don't even need them.
Yes, well, Mr. Kwok, what do you think? I mean, beyond the diplomatic statements, how concretely can France's forthcoming G7 presidency influence China's trade policy regarding the European concerns over industrial overcapacity or dumping?
I would see the effort for the coming French presidency in the G7 would be quite weak, because everybody knows the Macron's will stay office until 2027, and now the French is in a lame duck status, because Macron cannot have a very effective budget for saving the French economy. And also, and what the other guest has said, that is now the European the companies and enterprises would tell or even seek for the help for the von der Leyen, that is the EU institutions, to try to force them to speak to the Beijing for the problems, for the overcapacity, dumplings, and others as well. So now both France and the Germany, they have a relatively weaker, say, governance and government in terms of being the leader in the European politics. So I would say that the French presidency for pressing for saying on behalf of Europe, that kind of the bargaining power would be quite weak, because China just can simply ignore the France and Germany and those individual European states. I would say the China would rather having a little bit more concern on the European Union, because those European Union institutions, that is the von der Leyen, and speak for the whole European companies, and that kind of power is much more bigger than individual European states. So I don't think the Macron, his presidency in the coming G7 would be very effective for speaking on behalf of the Europe.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mr. Fursley, with European leaders divided, what is France's actual weight in consolidating a unified European economic security doctrine towards Beijing, especially concerning critical supply chain dependencies?
Well, I don't want to sound cynical, but France's likelihood of succeeding here is close to zero or below zero. Why? For a simple reason, international affairs, and now we have entered a new era. So once again, the second Trump presidency is going to be very different from the first one 8 years ago, because 8 years ago, in the first Trump presidency, the majority of Republican senators and congressmen on Capitol Hill, they were country club Republicans and neocons. They believed in free trade and open markets. What Trump did in the past 3-4 years, he completely got rid of the neoliberals and neocons inside his own Republican Party. So now it's a new Trump president. He can spread his wings, which he was unable to do 8 years ago. And now what is he doing? He's doing something called reindustrialization. By a cruel irony, and it's very cruel for the French, the idea of reindustrialization or economic nationalism was a French invention. It was invented by a French economist, and he was a prime minister of France. His name was Jean-Baptiste Colbert. Jean-Baptiste Colbert. What Trump is doing now is exactly following the economic doctrine of Jean-Baptiste Colbert, which is very harsh, which is very cynical and brutal, which is based on the belief that open markets and friendly alliances don't work, and it's every man for himself. And every man for himself means economic brutality, industrial nationalism. So only the strong will survive. And the Chinese, they can play that game. Guess what? Because the Politburo, the standing committee of the Politburo of the Chinese Communist Party, the center of the Chinese government, they also believe in Colbertism and industrial policy and long-term planning, just like Trump. So they are going to play that game, and many people, including the French and the Germans, will be losers. So in the age of geoeconomics, we'll have only a few winners and many losers. And the EU, the French, the Germans, I'm afraid, will be the biggest losers. The only winners will be pivot nations. What are pivot nations? Very quickly, small or mid-sized countries which are perceived as neutral or useful to the Americans and or the Chinese. And here, South Korea is a pivot nation. And look what happened to the Seoul Stock Exchange in the past 9 months. It went up 40 or 50% because South Korea, for them, that age of geoeconomics is good. And Russia, after the war with Ukraine ends very soon, Russia will be a pivot nation between the Chinese and the American giant. So, and likewise for Saudi Arabia and Brazil, but many countries stand to lose a lot. And what the Europeans are doing now is very silly because they are clinging desperately to the old ways, so which will fail.
Mr. Kwok, now, how will China's upcoming APEC chairmanship in 2026 be leveraged against the G7 presidency assumed by France, given the opposing strategic tactics within the bloc?
I would still think China would still consider rather than its relations with Russia, and I would still think China would still consider Europe as a very important strategic partner, because now there is no more future for the China and United States trade, and you are seeing there is a breakdown the relations between the Europe and the United States, and they, rather than the trade, they have many quarrels, and they are going to part away, and Europe would like to be an independent role. They want to be independent in terms of the economic affairs and other diplomatic affairs and military affairs, and so that's why I would say in the coming years, and if China doesn't want to be absolutely isolated, they will still consider, they won't try to deteriorate its relations with Europe, with the European Union, even though the European Union is already starting its tariff measures against the very cheap Chinese goods, and also the EVs. So I would still think that is the rather than strengthen its relations with Russia, and China still value the European Union is the biggest hedge for the deteriorating relations with the United States.
Mr. Fursley, given China's high industrial efficiency and lower production costs, can Macron's call for a balanced framework realistically protect key European sectors like automotive and chemicals from China's speed competition?
The short answer is no. The French, for example, the French and the Italian automotive industry are on a course to self-destruction, right? So basically, they've been losing market share for the past 6-7 years. So it's not new. When you lose market share year in, year out, every year, continuously for 7 straight years, is not only China's fault, right? It's partly your fault and mostly your fault. So the French and Italian auto industry are dying slowly. The German industry can survive. And it's interesting to see what is the survival strategy of BMW and Mercedes-Benz. What are they doing? And it's fascinating. BMW and Audi and Volkswagen and Mercedes-Benz, they're building new giant factories in 2 countries, America and China. That's very smart because the CEOs of BMW and Mercedes and Volkswagen figured out, unlike the French and the Italians, that the only way for them to survive is to adjust and adapt to the age of geoeconomics. Once again, the idea that only now there are only 2 superpowers left, America and China, they are both economic nationalists. If you want to sell cars, if you want to sell German cars in America and China, you have to build factories in Beijing, Shanghai, Oklahoma City, Philadelphia, New York. And that's exactly the German strategy or the Swiss strategy. And that is why in the age of geoeconomics, the Germans will do better than the French or better than the EU average. Very quickly, something interesting happened 3 weeks ago. Under pressure from Trump, the Dutch government illegally nationalized a small microchip manufacturer based in Amsterdam because, Trump wanted that. And immediately the Chinese threatened retaliation. How? Because Philips and Unilever, the 2 biggest Dutch companies, have tens of millions of clients in China. So the Chinese government, they told the Dutch, okay, you're nationalizing that Chinese-owned microchip maker in Amsterdam. We're giving you 2 weeks. If in 2 weeks it is still nationalized and we, the Chinese, are illegally expropriated, we are going to hit your companies, Philips, Shell, Unilever in China. And guess what? After 2 weeks, the Dutch prime minister yielded to the Chinese and he said, oh, sorry, it's a misunderstanding. We're giving you back the shares in that Dutch microchip maker. A big victory for China. And also it shows you that now economics and finance are based on power plays. It's pure crude power.
Yes. Well, Mr. Kwok, what do you think following these rare earth export threats? Is China using its dominance over critical raw material as a deliberate weapon of trade to influence the outcomes of market access negotiations with France and the EU?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Because so not just the France and the EU, even at this moment, I would say all parts of the world outside China depends on the supply chain of the for the manufacturing of and something about the rare earth manufacturing. The supply chain is all depends on China. Of course, in the very short term, at least the 3 or 5 or 10 years, the world still depends on the production, on the extractions of the rare earth by China. But of course, we're seeing the United States and is actively seeking the alliance with the Australia, with Japan, with even Africa and some African countries to try to tighten its grip on the supply chain of the rare earth. But of course, it takes time, and also and the most advanced extraction strategy for the extraction technology of the rare earth is still on the hands of China. And of course, the EU is also trying to chase the pace for what the United States is doing. But of course, the pace is much slower, and also the amount of capital cannot be compared with the United States. So I would say the rare earth is still the trump card for China to pressure countries except the United States to try to force them to accept what the China the terms, and if not, then China could use the rare earth to try to so-called to punish those countries. And for European Union, at this moment, they have to listen what the China says, or if not, their industrial base and their plants and the supply chain that is positioned in China alone, then you will see the result of the nexus factors that the Dutch government is trying to nationalize, and afterwards then just withdraw the nationalization.
I'll get back to you on that, Mr. Kwok, but Mr. Fursley, before that, regarding the new €3 billion EU strategy to reduce dependence on China for critical raw materials, is this investment enough to offset Beijing's chokehold on vital supply chains, particularly for green technologies?
Well, again, the short answer, sadly, I'm laughing because, as we say in French, in desperate circumstances, it's better to laugh than cry, right? So once again, sadly, the answer is no. Why is it no? It is coming too little too late. So it's just like basically Macron's trip to Beijing today. It's coming too late. The timing is bad. In geoeconomics, that very brutal game now that the Americans and the Chinese are playing aggressively, it takes real skills. It takes, fearless, brutal, ultra-realist. Trump is a neo-Nixonian. He's an ultra-realist. Xi Jinping and the Standing Committee of the Politburo in Beijing, they're also ultra-realist. They're not like jokers or amateurs. Sadly, Ursula von der Leyen and Emmanuel Macron give the impression to the outside world that they're amateurish, that they're not professional. So, spending 3 billion euros today is too late, and the amount of money is too small. Why is it a joke? Because there are two things when we speak about rare earth minerals. There's the extraction of rare earth minerals. So it means digging new mines, for exploring. So exploring, digging, operating new giant mines. That takes at least 4, 5, 6 years. So it's a joke when Ursula von der Leyen is saying, oh, don't worry, I'm going to go to Azerbaijan and Angola and Sudan, and you will see we, the Europeans, are going to dig and operate new mines in Africa and Central Asia. It's a joke. If they succeed, it will take them 4 or 5 years. But there's much worse. Apart from operating new mines, there is refining germanium, refining cobalt, refining gallium, all these rare earth minerals, is a very complicated technology. And guess what? Today there are rare earth mineral mines in America, Mexico, and the US. And they send 95% of their ores to China because China has the best refineries. And having the best refineries takes a lot of research and development in what? In engineering. That takes 10, 15 years, not 2 weeks. So it's a joke. What Ursula von der Leyen is saying is a joke.
Well, we could stay here and talk more about it, but unfortunately that's all the time we have for this discussion. Mr. Benny Kwok from Hong Kong, the international relations expert, and Mr. Meher Nicholas, firstly the director of the EU Asian Center from Sevilla. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us here on Think Tank. That concludes our deep dive into President Macron's crucial visit. The challenge remains for Paris, converting the strategic dialogue into tangible progress on both the massive trade imbalance and the critical push for peace in Ukraine. Will the G7 presidency empower France to lead Europe towards genuine reciprocity? We will continue to follow up all the outcomes here on Q News. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you for joining us.